Literally everything. All the articles of clothing you're wearing, all the devices you have, the electricity and air conditioning, wherever you are, all of that was created by individuals who are laboring to create things to make your life a little better. And that really is business. It's everywhere, so we don't notice it so much, but we sure would notice its absence.
Welcome to Acton Line, a product of the Acton Institute for the Study of Religion and Liberty. I'm Mark Townsend, producer. On today's episode, Acton librarian Dan Huger speaks with Jim Otteson from Acton University 2024. They discuss Adam Smith and what he tells us about the role of business in society today. This episode of Acton University was recorded at Acton University 2024. Acton University is Acton's flagship conference focused on building the foundations of human freedom and exploring the intersection of faith and free markets. To learn more, please visit university.acton.org, and to find additional content from previous Acton Universities, please visit ondemand.acton.org. You can find additional resources in the show notes for this episode, as well as find previous episodes of Acton Line at acton.org/actonline. And if you like this program, you can help us reach even more listeners by sharing it with a friend and leaving us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. We welcome your comments as well. Acton Line is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen.
Welcome. My name is Dan Huger, librarian and research associate at the Acton Institute. Today I am joined by Jim Otteson, professor of business ethics, Mendoza College of Business at the University of Notre Dame. Otteson lectures widely on Adam Smith, classical liberalism, political economy, business ethics, and related issues, including for the Fund for American Studies, the Adam Smith Society, our own Acton Institute, the Institute for Humane Studies, and the Tikva Fund. He is the author of many excellent books, including Actual Ethics, The End of Socialism, Honorable Business, 7 Deadly Economic Sins, and many books on Adam Smith, including The Essential Adam Smith from the Fraser Institute. We'll be discussing the role of business in society, its moral place in a commercial society, and what we can learn from Adam Smith about both questions. Jim, welcome to Acton Line, and thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much, Dan. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, one of the things that people who argue in favor of markets face is negative assumptions about the role of business in society. It happens every day on the streets today. It happened in antiquity. You can find great philosophers disparaging the commercial society, merchants. These are scoundrels. They don't, actually produce anything. They just move things back and forth. We've all heard comedy routines about middlemen, this sort of stuff. What is this? How does business contribute to society, and what is its social function beyond just the profits of the entrepreneurs or the enrichment of the people at the top of these businesses? What is the broader social function that so many people miss?
It's a great question, and thinking back, you covered a little bit of the history already, thinking about all the way back to the ancients and their criticisms of business and commercial activity. I mean, in ancient Greek philosophers were not thinking about market economies, anything like what we see today, so they didn't quite have that view, but they did have a view, and I'm speaking generally, and broadly, but many of them had the view that there were certain kinds of life that were appropriate to, a true man or a true virtuous person that involved, very grand adventures, like going to a foreign land and killing people and conquering things and taking land and taking people and taking, goods and other things. And what you get from the picture of commercial society or a business effectively from the Scottish Enlightenment forward, so the 18th century forward, is it offers a different picture. There's no question about it. So instead of saying, well, to realize your destiny as a great human being, you don't have to kill or attack or steal. Instead, you can find ways to improve others' lives. That's a very different vision, first of all, but it's a kind of, and this is one reason I think that that at least some people are a little less inspired by that kind of vision, is that it's a kind of a de-escalating. It's a lowering the eyes. So, we're not pioneers or adventurers on the frontier, fighting monsters or something. Instead, it's, well, I'm looking around the people I know or the others in my community. What problems are they facing? Is there some way that I could help them with that problem? And that's in one sense, it's a lowered expectation, sort of lowering our eyes a little bit. But on the other hand, and this is something I think does get missed, that's a really important thing to do.
Yeah.
Because it's a way of taking other people's lives seriously. So it's not just how can I, make myself writ large on the in the universe's script. It's, well, there are other people around me, and I have abilities, skills, knowledge. I'm in a certain kind of circumstance. Maybe so there's some way I can contribute value to other people, and that I think is something that's often missed about business. I mean, there are other aspects of it too, but one of the most important things I think about what I call honorable business, this term that I use, honorable business, is finding some difficulty that somebody else is facing or some challenge somebody's facing. It doesn't have to be a big existential thing. Yeah. But here's a problem that people seem to be having. They're spending their time doing this when it's a waste of their time, and if only this could be easier or this could be quicker, or maybe I could take care of that for them. And figuring out, asking yourself, well, how can I help those people? That's really what business is. Business is people who are trying to make other people's lives, even just incrementally or marginally, better. And in the process, freeing them to do other things, to turn marginally more of their attention away from the difficulties of life, and not even thinking about things like food, clothing, shelter, those kinds of enduring difficulties, but freeing a little bit of their attention away from some of those more basic needs, so that they can begin to turn their lives to other things that fill out a life of meaning and purpose. And that's something I think that people, I think of that, when I think of honorable business, it's people finding thousands, millions of ways to make our lives a little bit better in all of these ways we don't even think about. I mean, you said something about, what's business's role. You asked about what's business's role in society. Well, I would challenge anybody who asks that question, anybody who's listening, look around the room you are. Everything you see around you was created by human beings through business. Literally everything. All the articles of clothing you're wearing, all the devices you have, the electricity and air conditioning, wherever you are, all of that was created by individuals who are laboring to create things to make your life a little better. And that really is business. It's everywhere, so we don't notice it so much, but we sure would notice its absence.
So this reminds me, this quest to serve others, to find their needs, to fulfill their needs, it reminded me there's an old classic Simpsons episode where Homer Simpson runs...
The Simpsons, okay.
runs for garbage commissioner. And his tagline for his campaign is, why can't somebody else do it? And he names all of these things that make people's life better. Why can't the trash man go into my kitchen, get the bag there? Why do I have to go out and put it in the can by the street? Why can't somebody else do it? And while he's in there, why can't he wash the windows? And all of this, and his opponent, played by Steve Martin, voiced by Steve Martin, objects that this will break the city budget. Steve Martin loses in a landslide. Homer's plan tears through the city budget within 72 hours, and there's no more money to do all of these things. People's instinct is that sort of service can come from government, can come, we talk a lot about civil society here at Acton. We talk a lot about charitable groups doing this sort of thing, filling needs. What edge, or what does market transactions, what is business, what is that exchange, that profit and loss, what does that bring to the table that makes that service better or more sustainable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll have to go look up that Simpsons episode. I haven't seen that Simpsons episode, but or if I did, I don't remember it. But what market economies can do, what they can enable, there's no guarantees here. So, maybe I should preface it with saying, sometimes discussions of, different systems of political economy, what we often do, and by the way, from Plato on down, we sort of imagine the ideally good or the ideally perfect society, government, economy, et cetera. And we try to flesh it out in our imaginations, and then we look at the one we actually have, and of course it fails by comparison in a million different ways. And so we think, well, that therefore condemns what we have. Well, no system is perfect, and this is one lesson I think I've learned. I've tried to learn from the Scots, from the Scottish Enlightenment, David Hume, Adam Smith, these figures, that perfection is not on offer in this world. So, maybe in the next life, but not in this one. We're fallen creatures, imperfect creatures. So instead of saying, well, what would be the ideally perfect system, what we should be thinking about is what's best among the actually available alternatives. And that's a totally different conversation. And so that's a system that doesn't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and that recognizes that improvements are actually improvements, even if they're not yet perfection. And all of that leads to what I would say in response to your specific question about commercial society and markets. What do markets do? Well, they enable people to capitalize, no pun intended, to capitalize on one another's disparate and localized knowledge. So there are things you know about yourself and about your world. You have particular skills and abilities, and I don't know what those are, and I don't know what your schedule of values is, and I don't know what kinds of things you'd be willing to make a trade-off for and wouldn't be willing to make a trade-off for. But I don't have to know that in a market economy for you and I to benefit one another. All we have to figure out is if I say, well, here's something I could offer you, maybe I think that there's something you could do for me, either a good you could sell me or give me or trade me, or a service that you could provide for me. What we get in a market economy is the incentive for me then to think about, well, what could I provide you so that you would give that to me? I don't have to know everything about you. I don't really even have to know who you are. All I have to know is, maybe on just this one thing. Here's one thing that I can offer you, and that would be enough for you to come in and wash my windows in my kitchen. I don't need to know anything else about you, and then you don't need to know anything about me. Why would I want you to wash my windows? You don't need to know. Maybe it's a weird thing. Who knows? I'm just lazy or whatever. It could be anything. But what you get in a market economy is that you don't have to have some person external to it who's trying to organize and orchestrate everybody so that they all serve each other's needs. Instead, people figure that out on their own. So it's a kind of, it's an emergent system of cooperation that looks, if you try to take a 30,000-foot look, it looks as if, well, somebody must have planned all of that, for all of that good stuff to work out. But in fact, it's no single person planning it. What you're getting is people pursuing their own good by trying to cooperate with other people. And you don't really get that with almost any other system of political economy. So, what's the advantage that you get in a commercial society? It's that people are incentivized not just to think about, well, how can I make myself better off, or how can I serve my own ends? We do think about that, of course. But we realize that the only way I can serve even my own ends is by figuring out something to do for you. And you're thinking about that for other people, and yet other people are thinking about that for yet other people. And so this is what leads to these, this vast and often unnoticed, but expanse of mutual cooperation that no single person has to direct or orchestrate. But nevertheless, you get all of these people who are figuring out how to give you what you want so that they can get what they want.
Yep. So we've brought up these Scottish Enlightenment figures a couple times now. What is it in the water in Scotland other than the Loch Ness Monster? We know that, but there's something else in the water there that allows these folks, Adam Smith, David Hume, other figures, to start thinking about these things in a different way. What is that secret sauce?
That's a really good question, a hard question.
Yeah.
And I would like to say that I have the clear unequivocal answer to that. I'll give you a bit of a speculation. I mean, there's
Yeah.
probably many things going on, but one of the a bit of a speculation. So Hume in particular was quite impressed with what Isaac Newton had done in trying to figure out, come up with some descriptions of how things move on Earth, how they move in the heavens, and just looking at how they move and figuring out, relatively simple mathematical descriptions that capture their regular behavior, that reflect their regular behavior. So, I mean, many people were impressed with that Newton was able to do this. He'd come up with a few laws that described the motion. But what Hume and Adam Smith and Adam Ferguson and Francis Hutcheson and some others from the Scottish Enlightenment period, what they wondered was, well, could we do the same thing for human behavior? Is it possible that human beings engage in activity that is predictable enough that we can come up with, as Hume called it, a science of man?
Yeah.
So, trying to look at it inductively, view the kinds of societies human beings create over the centuries and in different circumstances. Are there patterns that emerge? What's interesting about that, I mean, many things are interesting about that, but one of the things that's interesting to me about that is that, when Newton was describing, say, the universal law of gravitation, he was specifically asked in his day, this was the end of the 17th century, but he was asked, well, okay, you've described this thing called gravity, but what is it exactly? You're just describing, its behavior. Well, what is the it? What is it? And his famous answer was, I don't know. I'm not making any hypothesis about it. I don't need to know. This is how it works. And that was kind of a shocking answer, that we're not, peering into the real essential reality of things. We're just looking at sort of the effects, the observable effects. That struck a lot of the Scots very deeply. Maybe we could do something about human beings too, and human behavior and human institutions. Human beings act as if they are self-interested, but not solely self-interested. They have benevolent feelings towards others, but it seems to be limited. They seem to have limited knowledge, et cetera. So there are various things that that look like they're universal, observable facts about human beings. And so what you got in the Scottish Enlightenment was then, in some ways, really for the first time, people thinking hard about, well, let's suppose that those things we seem to be observing about human behavior, let's suppose A, they're true, but B, they're fixed, meaning you can't really change it. So if human beings tend to be largely self-interested but with limited benevolence, for example, and that seems to be their motivation, well, how could we think of public social institutions like legal institutions or other kinds of institutions that would enable such people to cooperate together while minimizing conflict, while minimizing misery? And the thinking about that is what led them to start thinking about, well, maybe a more limited government that began with protecting property. Because if we're largely self-interested but only limited benevolence, maybe being able to own my own property will align my incentives in the right way that I'm encouraged to develop that property and to do more with it and to get more out of it and provide things for other people. And that, without telling all the pieces of the story, that gives you an idea of how they started to think about market economies then. Market economy grew out of this idea that, well, even if we're all let's pretend we're agnostic about whether there's a God or whether we're created in the image and likeness of God, whether there's another world after this one. What we do seem to observe is that there's a lot of conflict on Earth among humans. But maybe arranging our institutions in a certain kind of way can both minimize the conflict, reduce the conflict, and encourage people to engage in more mutually beneficial cooperation. If we can do that, then maybe it's not the perfect society, but that could lead to benefit and well-being for more and more people, and maybe even a great deal of benefit and well-being for more and more people. And there's where you get the market economy coming out of that.
So you have this tradition of reflection. That's a tradition of reflection not only on markets and how they operate, but people and how they operate in the world. And it's a moral philosophy in addition to economics. Now, traditionally, moral philosophy goes way, way, way back. Before this, the great religious traditions have different sort of moral philosophies. The great philosophers of ancient Greece, Rome, have different moral philosophies. How does this way of thinking about the moral universe, how does it relate to those? We talk a lot about the natural law tradition and its importance, which is an older tradition of moral reflection, which is grounded in different things. But as I look at that, and then I look at a book like Theory of Moral Sentiments with Smith, there's undoubtedly things in the Theory of Moral Sentiments that Smith is keenly observing, that we all observe in the world, and that seem to be part of the created order that, theists among us believe is part of God's law and providence in the world. How does this relate to these? Because some of these thinkers think this mode of thinking conflicts with that older mode, and that this is replacing that older mode with a newer way of thinking. But there have been other thinkers that have tried to sort of integrate the observations of both. How do we sort through that, or how do you, we have to sort through it all in our own various ways, but how do you sort through it as somebody who's dug really deeply into these texts and thought about it from the different angles?
Yeah, that's a great question. So here's where I think I would say Smith improved on Hume. Mm-hmm. Here's what I mean by that. So, Adam Smith wrote two books, only two books. The Theory of Moral Sentiments, which came out in 1759, that was the first edition, and the now much more famous Wealth of Nations came out in 1776. In the Wealth of Nations, the second book, there is no discussion of natural law, natural rights. Smith doesn't say, well, we have a right to our body and what we mix our labor with, like what John Locke argued, and that's why we have a right to property. There's none of that in there. And it's notable by its absence. So it wasn't as if he didn't know about this tradition. During the whole time he was composing The Wealth of Nations, Smith was giving lectures on jurisprudence in which he quoted Grotius and Locke extensively. So he was teaching about them. He knew about the tradition, but he didn't draw on it in The Wealth of Nations, which is interesting. In the Theory of Moral Sentiments, he talks about virtues, and he talks about a lot of he makes reference to many other thinkers, including ancient thinkers, about virtues. But here's a way, and I'll offer this to you for you to think about and for your listeners to think about. Here's a way that I think Smith might have been approaching this in the Theory of Moral Sentiments. So I think Smith was a theist. So there is a lot of scholarly debate about the extent to which he was a theist or not. He was certainly raised as a Christian. Then he became friends with Hume, and maybe things went in a different direction once he became friends with Hume. So scholars argue about the extent to which he was a theist. I think he was. But the approach that he takes in the Theory of Moral Sentiments, which is really an attempt to try to figure out where we get our moral sentiments from. Why do all adult human beings have moral sentiments? Where'd they come from? You start out without them. When you're a baby, you don't have any moral sentiments. But by the time you become an adult, you have a very sophisticated sense of moral sensibilities, of what's proper and improper, et cetera. Smith wanted to know what effectuated that process. How do we get that? So here's a way to think about the method that he was using in that book. Let's suppose God created human beings. So let's suppose there is a God, and it is the God, created human beings in his image and likeness. If that were true, how would we expect to see that manifested in the things human beings do? Okay, so the beginning of the book itself, I think, is bracketing that question and look at the first question, or the supposition that God created us and that we're maybe created specifically, specially created with a purpose, et cetera. We're going to bracket that and then just look at what do human beings do, and then see if it's consistent with what we would have expected if God had created us with special creation. And so Smith wants to know. He looks around, and says, well, what you might expect to see is that certain kinds of virtues would come to be recognized in almost all, maybe all human societies, and B, certain kinds of behaviors that would be connected with what they call virtues, but maybe not the same thing. Certain kinds of behaviors would be productive and would seem to lead to happiness. Other kinds of behaviors wouldn't. And that's what I think he finds. So he looks around, he identifies what he calls these four main virtues. Self-command, that's one, might think of as self-discipline. Prudence, that's the second one. Justice, and then beneficence. And he says those four virtues are recognized in different names maybe, different words, but recognized in basically all human societies, A, and B, people almost wherever they are in the world, any time, any place, and whatever else is true for their communities, if they follow those virtues, they're successful in life. They increase their well-being and they become happy. So that gives him what he thinks, that enables him to make many arguments. But one of them is that, well, first of all, human nature seems to be relatively constant around the world. The differences we see among human beings tend to be accidental and on the surface. They're not deep differences about human beings. B, it means that if you want to be happy, it's kind of a hypothetical imperative. If you want to be happy, here are the virtues you need to follow.
Yep.
Here they are. And not because God commanded you to, but if you want to be happy, this is what you need to do. And if you don't want to be unhappy, avoid these things. But I think, and this is my own interpretation of Smith, but I think what that meant for Smith was that, okay, that does confirm the hypothesis that God exists and God created us, because otherwise there's no way that the same set of behaviors and the same set of virtues would come up again and again in human societies around the world throughout time. There's no other way to account for it. So I think for him it was a confirmation of this theory, which gives you yet another reason to follow those virtues. Not only will it enable you to be successful in life, not only will it enable you to have good relations with other people, not only will it enable you to be happy, but it turns out that's pretty good evidence that God exists and he wanted you to do that too.
Yeah.
So you put all of those together, and I think for Smith, unlike Hume, I mean, you asked, and this is what sort of sparked this conversation, what's the connection between the virtues that people like David Hume talked about and, say, Aristotle talked about? Well, there's a lot of similarity in the terms and even in the approaches or the descriptions of these virtues, but there's no ultimate grounding of them. They seem to be floating out there, like accidental features, consistent with Newton saying, I don't know what gravity is, but this is how it works. And maybe that's enough for some people, but I think for Smith, and this is something that it offers me, so I'm a Catholic, and as a Catholic, I take this as a great vindication because, what you get is with the theological understanding or belief in God's existence and God's creation and human nature, the human person, that gives you the grounding that explains why we observe what we observe. So it's not just that it works, here's why it works. And so I think the Smithian picture is actually deeper and gives the grounding, the foundational grounding that you don't get with the Humean version or, for that matter, with the Aristotelian version.
This is also consistent with, what you see in the Old Testament all the time. Is if you do this, if you keep God's laws, covenants, then what? You prosper in the land, you have children, you're fruitful, you get all of the... So this sort of cause and effect, this conditional... Yep. Approach is something that you see in Scripture itself. I'm going to go out on a limb here because I'm just working from a very vague memory of reading from the Theory of Moral Sentiments years ago. But there's an offhanded remark that he makes that always intrigued me, where he's talking about, why do we make this sort of elaborate argument? There are many people who just say, well, God says you should, not steal. Like,
isn't that enough?
Why not? Yeah. And he goes back and he goes to Jesus Christ himself, who says to do unto others as they would have them do unto you. And that is a commandment that involves introspection. And it involves another level of analysis. And I am going to go back and look at this and make sure that I know what I'm talking about, because if I'm not, we'll just remove this. But this is something that as you were talking about this, it just struck me that was something that struck me in reading that and going through it. It's just a throwaway argument. Like Smith does, that's not the argument.
Yeah.
But it's a throwaway line that I thought was really, really intriguing, and is another point of sort of resonance with a scriptural tradition that I think people overlook.
No, I think it's yes, and there are a few places in the Theory of Moral Sentiments where Smith makes these remarks, where he'll occasionally, and it seems like offhandedly, he'll refer to the author of nature, capital A, capital N, but it doesn't seem to play much work in the actual theory or arguments he's presenting. But I think what's going on, I think you've put your finger on it. I think what he's seeing, or what thinks he's observing, is that the way human beings work, given their nature, which seems to be fixed, the circumstances, the nature of the human condition, the nature of the human person, the kinds of behaviors that they engage in that lead to happiness and success in life, the kinds of behaviors that move away from that, turns out they bear this really surprising coincidental resemblance to some of the things that Jesus said.
Yeah.
And so he mentions that a couple of times, but the theory he's trying to explain is, it's much more of a mechanical, and that's my term, but what can we observe about human beings? But if it turns out that what we can observe about human beings actually reflects and maybe even captures and is explained by some of the things that Jesus or the Christian tradition has held, wow, that's pretty powerful. So that's like, what more do you need? Jesus says this, the Bible says this. Oh, and it turns out empirical observation confirms many of the same things. That seems like a pretty complete case.
There are a lot of people, theologians, political theorists, Christians in other disciplines outside of economics, who are not sold by this case. Mm-hmm. What do you attribute that to? That reticence to take sort of the reticence to take economics as a science, to take seriously thinkers like Smith, like Hume. There's a lot of folks in especially conservative expressions of Christianity that will devalue and dismiss Enlightenment thinkers writ large.
Yeah.
How do you approach thinking about those folks' objections?
Yeah, I think there are maybe two things going on that both kind of incline at least some people to be dismissive of economics as a discipline, or the Scottish, some of the Scottish thinkers, or at the beginning of this discipline that we now call economics. So one of them is a more modern thing, and the modern thing is that if you open up an economics journal, a professional economics journal today, anywhere, what are you going to see? You're going to see a lot of math. There aren't words anymore. Where are the human beings in that? It's just a lot of math, and so it seems like it can seem like what economists are doing today is they're treating human beings as if they were just billiard balls that bouncing around that the physicist is describing. And if that's all they're doing, well, you're obviously missing what it means to be a human being. Mm-hmm. And so I think with fairness to people who are a little skeptical about economics, well, there are a lot of economists who treat human beings as if they are just these fungible tools or something that bounces around and doesn't reflect the fullness or richness of the human condition or human personhood. So that's part of it, I think. But another part of it, I think, is that economics itself. I mean, whether economics is a science or not, that's a big question. People argue about that.
Yeah.
But if you go back to the beginning of the discipline, or the beginning of what we now recognize as economics in 18th century Scotland, Scottish Enlightenment, what they were trying to do is to figure out human behavior. So they were focused on human beings, and they weren't necessarily thinking about them as just billiard balls bouncing around. But they were thinking, they discovered patterns, in certain kinds of situations. Many human beings will do this kind of thing as opposed to this kind of thing. But what they were not doing was exactly what you asked, or what you mentioned before, which was, well, why don't we just look and see what God told us to do and do that?
Yeah.
So you find a dearth. There is an absence of discussion of God. There is an absence of discussion of natural law, which we mentioned before. You don't find that in a lot of those first early proto-economists. And so that can look like, well, this is really a kind of godless enterprise. And if it's not just a godless enterprise, but it can also look like it's a reductive enterprise. Just, it's reducing human beings to just material objects responding to stimuli in their environments or something. And again, to be fair, there is some of that in economics. But what I think that is a little bit subtler that goes on with some economists, some of the great ones like Smith, for example, is that he's not trying to displace a full understanding of the human personhood with these set of tools we're trying to develop to predict, human behavior, but rather saying, no, if we think about human beings as being full persons with dignity, suppose we think of them like that, well, what are the sort of on-the-ground implications that would have for how we should arrange our social institutions? There are things we're going to want to do, like alleviate misery. What are the causes of misery for these people whose dignity we should be respecting? What are the causes of conflict, which often leads to violence, violent conflict and death? If we can figure out ways to minimize those things, to enable people who are suffering in poverty and misery to rise out of those conditions, that seems like a really good, important thing to do. And maybe we can't figure it out, but if we can figure something out, then we should do that. And that's actually, I think, consistent with viewing every human being as a precious, unique soul whose dignity we should take into consideration, rather than as viewing them all as sort of interchangeable, fungible units.
So this is great, because we've talked about why this thinking is interesting. We've talked about the insights that it grants. But the reason we continue to talk about these figures is because they transform the world in a very profound way. These ideas shaped institutions in the West and then in much of the rest of the world. And this is still a story that's unfolding. What does that transformation looked like in terms of, what did rulers who had policymakers or, princes who all of a sudden, they stumble upon this new way of thinking? What does that change about the world? What does that change about, we have I think it's the Wealth of Nations is 1776, which I always think is rather
an auspicious year.
Auspicious. And I think there's a reason that coincidence looms large. Because there's an institutional shape to these ideas, to this notion of Dan Klein at George Mason University. What does he call? He traces the use of liberalism, and it's philosophy of liberty. I'm totally blanking on it now. But you start to get this. You start to get not just discussing economics and analysis of the human person, but a political tradition emerges out of this that begins to sort of transform the world.
Yeah. And I think it did completely, you're right. I mean,
system of natural liberty.
Oh, this is Smith's, yes.
Yes.
So he calls it the obvious and simple system of natural liberty. Yeah, it's kind of a mouthful. People want to know, well, was he a conservative? Was he a liberal? Was he libertarian? Well, the obvious and simple system of natural liberty is what he suggested. But that was as close as he came to, sort of naming what his system would look like. But I think you're right that it really did create and give rise to quite a transformation in many ways, economically, politically, socially. The last 200 years have been different in human history from basically everything that went before, especially if you think about economically, et cetera. But you're asking about, what actually is this difference? And I think one way to think about it, and if you'll allow me to make one historical anecdote. You've heard the phrase, the dismal science. Mm-hmm. Economics called the dismal science. So many people have heard that, and they repeat that. And I think today most people, when they hear that phrase or they use it, they think it just means it's boring. It's dismal. That wasn't the origin of that phrase. The origin of that phrase comes from Thomas Carlyle in the 19th century, who described these early political economists like John Stuart Mill and his father James Mill and Adam Smith, these figures who were the first people we think about as developing a political economy, a system of economics. It was dismal because, he says, because what it suggested was that there was no longer this clear and by nature natural division among the moral superiors and the moral inferiors. Mm-hmm. And of course, Carlyle imagined himself as a moral superior, And if you think of yourself as a moral superior, and you're in a small select group of people who are superior to others morally, then that can give you a sense of identity and purpose, because what's my job as a good, morally superior person? It's to help you who are morally inferior. It's to direct your life and direct your affairs. And what Carlyle was realizing was that this economics, these Adam Smith people were saying, no, other people can improve their own lives. They don't really need your help. Mm-hmm. If you just protect their lives, you protect their property, and then just leave them alone, they'll figure out their own ways to improve their lives. And it might not be exactly what you would have wanted for them, but they'll improve their lives, and you can trust them to do it, by and large. They don't need your help. Well, what does that mean in effect for a person like Carlyle? It's like inviting his resignation. You don't need to do the job anymore that you think you should be doing. And I think that and that's why I called it dismal. That was a dismal prospect. What on earth are the English gentlemen like me who are the moral superiors to the world? What are we supposed to do now? Well, right, go get a job. Why don't you start a business, do something else, which he and others thought was beneath them somehow to do that. Their job was to direct other people. That really is a big part of the transformation that effectuated, but I think is also part of the challenge today, because there's a part of human nature that what's the right way to describe this? Enjoys, maybe even revels in the idea that I'm better than you, and my job is to boss you around, is to tell you all the ways you're going wrong and all the things you need to be doing. And many of us, maybe it's part of all of us in some way or other, we've had that kind of itch to tell other people what to do. What the liberal system of the obvious and simple system of natural liberty in Smith, as Smith describes it, what that suggests is that that more and more people should resist that itch. Focus on your own life and the life of your own community and the life of your own family, and improve that, and stop worrying about other people's lives. Let them worry about theirs. They will figure out ways to improve themselves. And many people don't like that idea. It's very hard for people to accept. So that was one of the big transformations, and I think it's still something we have a challenge with, because think about the world today. How many people are there in the world today who derive a sense of identity for their lives and purpose for their lives in the idea that I need to help you. You can't solve your problems on your own. I need to come and solve your problems for you. That's a lot of us, I fear, and I confess that we all have a little bit of it, but there are a lot of people like that. And one of the recurring challenges of liberalism is that it's suggesting to such people, if you want to improve the world, maybe the first step is to present the world with one improved unit, yourself. Before you improve everybody else's life, make your own life, make yourself better. And that's harder to do than taking the beam out of your own eye is harder than seeing the beam in your neighbor's eye. And many of us like that instead. And liberalism says no. Let's just think about yourself and improve yourself and your own family first, and improve the lives of people and your neighbor. And instead of solving world poverty, help your neighbor when he has a problem with his fence. It's one thing. It's much easier, and we feel better about ourselves if I say, I care about the world's poor, but I don't care about my actual neighbor. And that's what liberalism, that version of liberalism, I think, is saying, no, let's actually think about the problems right around us and actually do something about them.
So the good news is that we have a fixed nature, and the bad news is that we have a fixed nature. Jim, thank you so much for being with us today. This has been enlightening for me, and this has given our listeners a lot to think about. And this is this way of thinking that Adam Smith so sort of robustly embodied, both in the sort of economic analysis and in turning that same sort of critical lens to human behavior as such and to morals is something that can help us individually, and it can also help our societies flourish if we take heed. Thank you again.
My pleasure. It's been a great pleasure having the conversation. Thank you for having me.
As always, thank you for listening. Our team loves putting this podcast together for you. It's encouraging to hear from our listeners. Feedback is incredibly important because it lets us know what topics you are interested in most. If you have comments, feedback, or ideas for a show topic or interesting guest, you can email our team at producer@acton.org. Until next week, for Acton Line, I'm Mark Townsend.